And welcome back. Dr. Kelton, you're still with us? Hello?
Hello.
Hey, you're still with us.
I'm here.
We're back on the air here. I wrote an interesting piece in today's Financial Times about how the Fed is seriously considering unwinding all the toxic assets on their balance sheet. I'm presuming this is left over from, all the acquisitions they did in 2008 to bail out the banks. Are you familiar with the article, and can you explain to me what it was saying?
No, I'm not familiar with the article. I spent most of the morning working on grading papers and doing other things,
okay.
So I'm afraid I didn't catch up on my Financial Times this morning. But
my apologies.
I am familiar with the debate over the unwinding of the Fed's balance sheet. So.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the Fed probably, we just recently had a conference up in New York. I think just a week or so ago, I was at a conference. We had Esther George there. She's the president of the Kansas City Fed, and she spent an awful lot of time in her remarks talking about the need, from her perspective, for the Fed to do this unwinding process, to sell back into the private sector some of the mortgage-backed securities and government bonds that the Fed bought as part of its quantitative easing program. And the best I could tell, her argument was simply that the balance sheet is big, and it's not normally this big, and therefore it needs to be made smaller. We need to get it back down to its so-called normal size. And beyond that, it wasn't really clear to me exactly what the Fed thinks it will accomplish by selling bonds, by doing this unwinding. So in other words, what the Fed did was to try to stimulate the broader economy. It engaged in this bond-buying program called quantitative easing. I don't know how much your listeners remember or paid attention to this sort of thing, but this is when, and the Fed did several rounds of this. There was a QE1, and then there was a QE2, and then there was this open-ended QE3, which was Bernanke saying, we're going to do this until we decide to quit. It was open-ended. It didn't have a date, a specific date. We're going to do it until this date, like the first two rounds. So what the central bank did was go into the open market and buy financial instruments, mortgage-backed securities, and U.S. government bonds, and they were buying $85 billion a month. And they did this month after month after month after month with several goals sort of in mind. One was, we're going to take all of these securities off of the balance sheets of private sector actors and replace them with, let's call it cash. It's really just accounts of the Fed. So we're going to give them cash instead. And what that was supposed to do was, by bidding up the price of these financial instruments, treasuries, let's say, it would push down the yield. So long-term interest rates would go down. And that was supposed to do a couple of things. One, it would allow homeowners to refinance maybe at lower interest rates. That would free up some additional income that people could go out and spend. It would push long-term interest rates down and maybe encourage some businesses to borrow for long-term investment projects, and so that could stimulate the economy. Broad interest rates would go down, and so people might decide to borrow for an automobile purchase or a durable good, something that's longer lasting that you might borrow money to finance. Maybe even education or something like that. And it would push investors into riskier asset classes. And the Fed made it clear that this was actually an objective. They wanted the so-called reach for yield to get investors to reallocate their portfolios and start buying riskier assets. Why? Because it would push up the price of a whole bunch of other financial assets, and then hopefully through the rising asset prices, you would generate a wealth effect.
Dr. Kelton, we were just talking about the Fed unwinding their balance sheet. I understand that a lot of what they're holding are mortgage-backed securities that are poisoned, basically, that are not worth what they were bought for. What do they do about that? Do I have that right? Number one, and
I don't think so. I don't think so.
So
I know early on, in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, probably the Fed was buying, lots of mortgage-backed securities, and surely at that time, many of those were included mortgages that were not being serviced. People couldn't afford the homes that they got into, and they weren't paying on those. But I don't think the Fed is currently holding junk assets. I really don't. I don't think that's part of what they want to do, is sell bad assets into the economy.
Right. Hopefully.
Yeah.
So what is your take on, you've basically shared with us where you think we're at. Where should we be going as opposed to the Trumponomics approach? It sounds like you're very skeptical that Trump's economic approach is going to do any good for our economy at all. What should we be doing?
Well, I mean, I think that, look, I think that the objective has to be clear. And if in part Donald Trump is president of the United States today because people had a perception and a realization that income and wealth inequality in this country was absolutely out of control, that the rich were doing far too well at the expense of the vast majority of the population, and that something has to change. So if you think that that's part of what drove Donald Trump into office, then I think that to the extent that his policies don't arrest those trends and, more importantly, begin to reverse those trends, then I think we're going to have to judge them as a failure. Now, Donald Trump is not promising to deal with rising income and wealth inequality. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, vote for me, do my economic agenda, and I'm going to be the greatest job creator God has ever known, and we're going to have rapid growth and all this kind of stuff.
Chicken in every pot.
Yeah, right. And it's all going to trickle down, and it's going to raise the well-being of everybody. But, as you point out, this is not likely to happen. We've tried this before. This is an agenda that, while it is going to be very good for a very small number of people, it is not likely to deliver on the promises that he made to the broader middle class and to struggling working Americans. So if the question is, what should he be doing instead, I think the answer is he should be designing an economic program, an agenda that is designed specifically to address the ailing middle class, the Rust Belt communities, to bring jobs to those communities. How would you do that? What are the kinds of policies? Would they be tax breaks for the people at the very top? Would they be these public-private partnerships to try to get infrastructure done? I say no, it wouldn't be. We would do the old-fashioned way of doing infrastructure. We'd have federally funded infrastructure, large-scale investments in our communities, infrastructure, education, research and development. Those are the types of programs. Quite frankly, it's the Sanders agenda is what it is. Those are the kinds of economic policies that will address specifically the income, the wealth inequality, the economic insecurity of the broad middle class and poor Americans.
Wouldn't that also require raising taxes on rich people and big corporations?
Well, it wouldn't, actually. You and I have had these conversations in the past, and I think you probably know that my position is that it's possible for the federal government of the United States to make the vast majority of people better off without necessarily making anyone else worse off. Now, that doesn't mean that because you don't have to go find rich people and get them to pay for everything you want to do, that it doesn't make sense to raise taxes on rich people. I think that's a different question, though. That's a question where you say, what are we going to do about rising income and wealth inequality? And if you think that the existing levels of wealth and income inequality in this country are a problem, and I do, then you can work through the tax system.
We're out of time. We're hitting the hard break at the bottom of the hour. Dr. Stephanie Kelton, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We'll be back.